They thought her English was broken, but before the night was over, the richest man at the table would answer in the language they were too arrogant to respect. Bellagio House glowed above Manhattan like a private secret, all white tablecloths, crystal glasses, polished silver, and candles floating in amber light. Outside, late rain slid down the tall front windows and blurred the city into gold and black streaks. Inside, every plate arrived like a small ceremony. The room was full of people who knew how to lower their voices when discussing money, how to smile without warmth, and how to make a server feel invisible without ever raising a hand. Naomi Baptiste moved through that room in a pressed black uniform and a clean white apron, carrying herself with the careful grace of a woman who had learned that one nervous mistake could cost more than a shift. She was 28, a nursing student by day, a waitress by night, and by 10 o'clock her feet ached inside shoes that had already walked more miles than most guests would ever notice. Still, she smiled. Still, she remembered who wanted sparkling water, who disliked pepper, and which table needed a slower pace because the conversation mattered more than the food. At the center table, near the wine wall, sat Malcolm Pierce, a finance man with a silver watch and a voice trained to own rooms. Beside him was his wife, Eleanor Pierce, elegant in cream silk, smiling as if kindness were something she could afford but chose not to purchase. Around them sat 4 guests and one man who barely spoke at all. Vincent Callahan, dressed in a black suit and white shirt, sat at the end of the table with a glass of red wine untouched before him. To strangers, he looked like just another powerful man. To people who knew New York's quieter doors, he was the man whose approval could open restaurants, close deals, and turn a handshake into a fortune. Naomi approached with the evening's specials held against her chest. She had practiced them twice near the service station. Braised short rib with rosemary reduction, seared scallops with lemon beurre blanc, wild mushroom risotto finished with shaved parmesan. Her English was good, but stress had a way of tightening certain words, pulling old sounds from her mother's kitchen in Brooklyn into the polished air of places like this. She began softly, professionally, eyes moving from guest to guest. Tonight, our special is braised short rib with rosemary reduction, served with roasted carrots and whipped potatoes. The word reduction came out slightly bent, the final syllable heavier than she wanted. Eleanor's smile sharpened. "I am sorry," she said, tilting her head. "Could you say that again?" Naomi knew that tone. It was wrapped like politeness, but there was no kindness inside it. She repeated the sentence, slower this time, and the words still carried the rhythm of home. A small laugh slipped from Eleanor's mouth, bright and delicate enough to pass for manners if no one cared to look closely. "Does the restaurant charge extra for translation?" The table laughed. Not loudly. That would have been honest. They laughed in the expensive way, behind fingers, into napkins, with eyes that flickered toward Naomi and away again. Naomi stood still with the menu in her hands. Heat climbed her neck. Her smile remained because rent did not pause for humiliation, and tuition did not care whether a rich woman had been cruel. Malcolm looked at his wine instead of his wife. One guest murmured, "It is charming, really. Very authentic." Another asked, "Do you understand the whole menu, or just the parts they give you?" Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the leather cover. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice from their small Brooklyn apartment, speaking Creole over simmering cornmeal and coffee. "Never be ashamed of the language that carried you here." But Bellagio House was not her mother's kitchen. It was marble floors, silent managers, and guests who could turn a complaint into a lost job before dessert. Naomi lowered her eyes for half a breath, then lifted them again. "Yes, sir. I understand the menu." The table went quiet enough to enjoy her discomfort. At the far end, Vincent Callahan finally moved. He did not speak. He only set down his fork with such calm precision that the silver touched porcelain like a small bell. His eyes did not go to Naomi first. They went to Eleanor, then to Malcolm, then around the table to every face that had laughed because a working woman's accent made them feel taller. Naomi swallowed and prepared to continue, unaware that the most dangerous man at the table had just stopped listening to the menu and started measuring the character of everyone seated there. Naomi knew how to survive a room without letting the room know it had hurt her. She had learned that skill long before Bellagio House, long before polished wine glasses and guests who treated pronunciation like a measure of intelligence. In Brooklyn, Inside a fourth-floor apartment above a laundromat that smelled of soap and warm metal, her mother had raised her on two rules: do honest work and never apologize for the voice God gave you. Marie Baptiste spoke Haitian Creole when she prayed, English when she filled out hospital forms, and French when she sang old songs while stirring cornmeal over the stove. To Naomi, language had never been broken. It had been the sound of rent paid late, but paid, medicine measured carefully, birthday candles saved from one year to the next, and a mother who could stretch one chicken into 3 dinners without making it feel like poverty. But Bellagio House had a way of making even memory feel out of place. There, words had to arrive clean, smooth, and expensive. Anything else became entertainment. Naomi had spent months practicing in the bathroom mirror before shifts, shaping vowels until her mouth felt borrowed. She would whisper reduction, beurre blanc, sommelier, reservation, apology. The last word was the one the job demanded most often. That night, as Eleanor Pierce's laughter floated across the table, Naomi felt every practiced word begin to loosen. She wanted to explain that she was not confused. She wanted to say she had passed anatomy exams while other people slept, that she could pronounce medication names longer than anything printed on the menu, that she had translated discharge instructions for neighbors who were too afraid to ask doctors questions. Instead, she stood beside the table with her spine straight and her voice controlled. "Would you like me to continue with the specials, ma'am?" Eleanor leaned back as if Naomi had offered her a show. "Yes, please. Slowly this time. We would not want to miss anything." A few guests smiled into their glasses. Malcolm Pierce adjusted his cuff links and pretended the ceiling lights deserved his attention. Vincent Callahan watched that small movement, the cowardice of a man who could command a boardroom but not correct cruelty at his own table. Naomi continued. "The second special is seared scallops with lemon beurre blanc, served with asparagus and fingerling potatoes." The French came out careful but accented, warmed by the Creole her mother had spoken over Saturday laundry and Sunday soup. Eleanor lifted her eyebrows. "Beurre blanc," she repeated with exaggerated softness, turning the words into a toy. "How sweet." Naomi's thumb pressed against the edge of the menu until the leather bit into her skin. At the service station, a younger busser named Caleb looked down, jaw tight, because he knew what it meant to need a job more than justice. The manager, standing near the host's stand, saw the table laughing and chose not to walk over. In places like Bellagio House, silence had a uniform too. It wore a suit, carried a tablet, and called itself professionalism. Naomi finished describing the specials, each word placed carefully, each breath measured. When she asked if they had any questions, Eleanor smiled. "Only one. Where are you from, really?" The table went still in the way rooms do when everyone knows a line has been crossed, but no one wants to pay the price of saying so. Naomi lifted her eyes. "Brooklyn, ma'am." Eleanor laughed again, softer this time. "No, sweetheart. Before Brooklyn." For the first time, Naomi's smile faded. Not completely. Just enough for Vincent to see the person beneath the training, the daughter beneath the apron, the woman being asked to shrink her whole history into something a stranger could mock between courses. The candlelight trembled against the silverware. Rain tapped the windows. And at the end of the table, Vincent Callahan's untouched wine sat dark as a warning. Naomi answered with the careful patience of someone who had been asked the same question too many times in too many expensive rooms. "My family is Haitian, ma'am." Eleanor Pierce smiled as if she had just found the loose thread she wanted to pull. "There it is," she said, turning slightly toward the others. "That explains the music in the vowels." A man near the center of the table chuckled. Another guest looked at his plate, but not because he was ashamed enough to stop it. He only wanted the discomfort to pass without touching him. Naomi stood beside the table with the specials menu pressed to her apron, feeling the room tilt around her while every candle seemed suddenly too bright. She thought of her mother's hands, brown and steady, folding hospital scrubs after 16-hour shifts, saying, "A person who laughs at your accent is usually afraid of what your courage says about them." Naomi had not understood that as a child. She understood it now, standing 6 feet from people who could buy $500 bottles of wine but could not afford decency. Eleanor lifted her glass and continued, "Say something in it." Naomi blinked. "Excuse me, ma'am?" "Your language," Eleanor said, smiling wider. "Say something. I have always found those island languages so lively." The words landed softly, but they carried dirt. Naomi felt Caleb freeze near the service station. She felt the manager watching from across the room, still deciding that a VIP table mattered more than an employee's dignity. She felt Malcolm Pierce shift in his chair, uncomfortable enough to know better, comfortable enough to do nothing. Vincent Callahan remained still at the end of the table, but something in his eyes had gone colder. Naomi could have walked away. She should have, maybe. But rent was due in 4 days. Her nursing program payment was due on Friday, and her mother's blood pressure medication sat in a pharmacy bag with a receipt Naomi had not yet been able to cover. So she swallowed the answer she wanted to give and chose the one that would keep her employed. "I am here to serve dinner, ma'am. Would you like to order?" For a brief moment, the room seemed to honor her restraint. Then Eleanor laughed again, quieter, sharper. "How professional. But I still think we should hear it. Malcolm, do you not agree? It might make the evening memorable." Malcolm's mouth lifted without conviction. "Eleanor, let the young lady work." It was the kind of defense that asked cruelty to lower its volume, not leave the room. Naomi knew the difference. Eleanor turned back to her with a look of sweet control. "All right then, read the scallop special again. I want to hear it properly." Naomi's breath tightened. The menu words blurred for 1 second, not because she could not read them, but because humiliation has a way of standing between the eye and the page. She began again, voice lower this time. "Seared scallops with lemon beurre blanc, asparagus, and fingerling potatoes." Eleanor repeated the phrase after her, bending the accent, making the table smile. A thin silence followed, the kind that exposes everyone and forgives no one. Vincent finally reached for his wineglass, but he did not drink. He turned the stem once between his fingers, watching Malcolm more than Eleanor now. In Vincent's world, character was not measured by the person who made the cruel remark. That was easy to see. Character was measured by the person with power sitting close enough to stop it, who chose not to. Naomi took the table's appetizer order with a steady voice, writing each item carefully on her pad. By the time she stepped away, her cheeks were calm, her posture straight, and only her hands betrayed her, trembling once before she tucked the pen into her apron pocket. At the service station, Caleb whispered, "I am sorry." Naomi shook her head gently, not trusting herself to speak. Across the room, the kitchen doors swung open and released a rush of heat, garlic, and steam. Behind her, Eleanor's laughter rose again, delicate and polished. And at the table, Vincent Callahan placed his untouched wine back on the white cloth with a sound so small that only Naomi heard it. Yet somehow it felt like a verdict beginning to form. Naomi carried the appetizer order toward the kitchen as if the paper in her hand weighed more than the silver trays stacked beside the pass. The hallway behind the dining room was narrow and hot, filled with the hiss of pans, the call of ticket numbers, and the sharp green smell of parsley being chopped under fast knives. For 3 seconds, hidden from the guests, she let her shoulders drop. Not enough to break, just enough to breathe. Caleb stood near the water station with a tray of clean glasses, watching her with the helpless anger of someone too young and too afraid to challenge the people who paid the bill. "You do not have to go back to that table alone," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him and gave the smallest smile. "Yes, I do." It was not bravery the way movies like to show it. It was rent, tuition, medicine, and the knowledge that dignity sometimes had to survive inside silence until the right moment arrived. She placed the order in the system, checked the modifiers twice, and stepped back into the dining room, where Bellagio House shimmered as if nothing ugly had happened beneath its chandeliers. At the VIP table, Eleanor Pierce was telling a story with her hands, laughing before the ending so the others would know when to join her. Malcolm Pierce nodded beside her, performing patience, performing authority, performing the kind of good manners that never protected anyone. Vincent Callahan saw all of it. He had built parts of his life around the ability to read a room before the room understood itself. Men with too much money often revealed themselves in how they treated risk. Men with borrowed power revealed themselves in how they treated workers. Malcolm had come to Bellagio House expecting Vincent to discuss a partnership, a luxury dining venture tied to private clubs in Miami and Las Vegas, a deal worth enough to make everyone at the table careful. But Malcolm had not been careful with the one thing Vincent valued most. He had allowed his wife to turn a waitress into entertainment and had called his own silence restraint. Vincent's eyes moved to Naomi as she returned with bread plates, her face composed, her hands steady again. He remembered another woman in another kitchen, years before Manhattan learned his name. Solange had been Haitian, a neighbor in Queens who took him in after his mother died and his father disappeared into work and grief. She had spoken Creole while folding sheets, while stirring soup, while telling a lonely boy that a house could still be warm even when life had emptied it. Other children had laughed at the way she spoke English. Vincent had been too young then to know how to answer them. He had never forgotten the shame of his silence. Now, at a table dressed in white linen, that old memory sat beside him like a debt. Naomi placed a basket of warm bread near Eleanor, who glanced up with bright cruelty disguised as charm. "Careful," Eleanor said. "We would not want you to explain the butter in 3 languages." A few guests smiled again, but the laughter came weaker this time. Something in Vincent's stillness had begun to change the temperature of the table. Naomi straightened. "The butter is whipped with sea salt and chives, ma'am." Her voice was calm, but Vincent heard what everyone else missed, the effort it took to keep it from shaking. Eleanor tilted her head. "And how would you say that at home?" The question floated above the table, polished and poisonous. Naomi's eyes lowered for one beat. When she lifted them again, there was no anger in them, only exhaustion wrapped in discipline. "At home, ma'am, we usually say thank you before we eat." The table froze. Not because Naomi had insulted anyone, but because she had not. She had answered with manners so clean they made Eleanor's cruelty look common. Caleb stopped moving near the service station. The manager turned from the host's stand, sensing trouble but not understanding where the power had shifted. Malcolm's smile thinned. Eleanor's face tightened behind the candlelight. And Vincent Callahan, still seated at the end of the table, finally looked directly at Naomi with the quiet recognition of a man who had just seen someone win without raising her voice. For one breath, no one knew how to respond to Naomi's answer. The candle flames trembled above the white linen, and the sounds of Bellagio House seemed to pull away from the VIP table, leaving only the soft rain against the windows and the quiet weight of embarrassment settling where laughter had been. Eleanor Pierce's smile held for a second too long, then hardened. She had expected Naomi to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller so the table could return to feeling powerful. Instead, this waitress in a black uniform had answered with grace so precise it exposed the ugliness beneath Eleanor's polish. Malcolm cleared his throat and reached for his water, still hoping the moment would pass without requiring him to become a better man. Vincent Callahan watched him do it, and the final measure of Malcolm's character landed silently. Eleanor turned her glass by the stem and said, "How clever. I suppose that sounded better in whatever language you speak at home." Naomi did not move. Her face stayed calm, but something in her chest tightened around her mother's voice, around Sunday mornings in Brooklyn, around prayers whispered in Creole while steam rose from a pot of soup. She had spent years learning how to make English acceptable to rooms like this, and now Eleanor wanted the language of her home placed on the table like a party trick. Vincent set his napkin beside his plate. The movement was simple, but every person at the table felt it. Eleanor, still smiling, leaned forward. "Tell us then, what language do you speak when you are not trying so hard?" The words were gentle enough to pass as curiosity, but everyone heard the edge. Naomi's fingers rested against the side of her apron. Caleb, frozen near the service station, looked as if he wanted the floor to open. The manager took one step closer from the host's stand, not to protect Naomi, but to protect the illusion of an expensive evening. Naomi answered quietly, "Haitian Creole, ma'am." Eleanor inhaled as if preparing another laugh. She never got to release it. Vincent spoke before she could. His voice was low, clear, and steady, carrying across the table in flawless Creole. "Pa kite won't yo meet, so o you vin non pa o you." Naomi's eyes lifted at once. The room did not understand the words, but it understood the change. Malcolm stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth. Eleanor's lips parted without sound. One of the guests sat back as if the chair beneath him had shifted. Vincent looked only at Naomi. Then he translated, still calm, still seated, still more dangerous in restraint than other men were in anger. "Do not let the shame they place on you become your name." The dining room went silent. Not the polite silence of wealth, but the naked silence that arrives when cruelty is caught wearing manners. Naomi stood with the bread plate between her hands, and for the first time that night, her accent was not being weighed, corrected, or mocked. It had been answered. It had been recognized. It had been called by its true name, home. Naomi did not realize she had been holding her breath until the Creole left Vincent Callahan's mouth and gave the air back to her. For a moment, Bellagio House no longer felt like marble, crystal, and money. It felt like her mother's kitchen in Brooklyn at 6 in the morning, when the windows fogged from the heat of soup and Marie Baptiste hummed old hymns while tying a scarf around her hair. Naomi heard the rhythm of home inside Vincent's voice, not perfect like a performance, but lived in, carried with respect. The bread plate trembled once in her hands before she steadied it. Eleanor Pierce stared at Vincent as if he had broken a rule no one had spoken aloud. Powerful men were not supposed to understand the languages of the people she dismissed. Malcolm Pierce lowered his glass slowly, his confidence thinning under the candlelight. Vincent looked at Naomi, not the table, and said in English, "Miss Baptiste, would you tell me about the short rib the way you would describe it to someone you loved?" Naomi blinked. No guest had ever asked her that. They asked what was gluten-free, what was expensive, what paired with a bottle they wanted others to notice. They did not ask what food meant when it left the menu and returned to memory. She glanced toward the manager, who stood stiff near the host's stand, unsure whether to interrupt a man whose name carried more weight than the reservation book. Vincent did not look away from Naomi. "In Creole first, if you prefer." A silence opened, but this time it did not push her down. It made room. Naomi drew one careful breath. Then she spoke. At first, her Creole was soft, almost private. She described the short rib as meat that needed patience, not pressure, time, garlic, onion, and heat moving slowly until toughness surrendered into tenderness. She spoke of her mother cooking on Sundays, of neighbors smelling food through the hallway, of a small apartment becoming big enough for anyone who came hungry. The words flowed from her with a grace English had never lacked, only hidden when shame stood too close. Caleb listened from the service station, eyes shining. The guests did not understand every word, but they understood the music had changed. This was not entertainment. This was inheritance. When Naomi finished, Vincent nodded once, then repeated part of her description in English for the table. She said patience is what makes tough things tender. His eyes moved to Eleanor. "That is not on the menu, but it is worth more than anything you ordered." Eleanor's face flushed beneath her careful makeup. "I did not mean anything by it," she said quickly. The sentence arrived late and empty. Vincent folded his hands on the table. People often say that after meaning something long enough to be heard. Malcolm gave a tight laugh that fooled no one. "Vincent, surely we do not need to turn dinner into a lecture." Vincent finally looked at him. "No, we need to turn it into a measure." The room seemed to lower its voice around them. A man's table reveals him before his contract does. Malcolm's jaw shifted, but he said nothing. Naomi stood beside them, no longer trapped inside the laughter that had started the evening. She was still in uniform. She was still holding bread. She was still working. But something invisible had changed its owner. The shame no longer belonged to her. It sat on the white linen among the untouched glasses, waiting for the people who had brought it there to recognize its weight. Vincent Callahan let Malcolm's silence sit on the table until it became heavier than the silverware. No one reached for bread. No one lifted a glass. Even the nearby tables had begun to sense that something larger than dinner had entered the room. Eleanor Pierce looked from Vincent to Naomi, then back again, searching for a graceful exit from a moment she had built with her own hands. "This has become very dramatic," she said, trying to smile. "I simply enjoy languages." Vincent's expression did not change. "No," he said. "You enjoyed making her feel smaller." The sentence was quiet, but it crossed the table with the force of truth. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, not from shame now, but because hearing someone name the cruelty so plainly made her chest ache. For years, people had called it teasing, curiosity, preference, professionalism, customer service. They had wrapped disrespect in soft words until the blade disappeared. Vincent had pulled the wrapping away. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her napkin. "You are misunderstanding me." Vincent leaned back slightly, his voice still calm. "I understand you perfectly. I have heard this kind of laughter before." His gaze shifted past the candlelight, past the wine wall, into a memory only he could see. After my mother died, a woman named Solange took care of me in Queens. She was Haitian. She worked all day, came home tired, and still made sure a boy who was not hers ate dinner, finished homework, and did not feel forgotten. Naomi looked up. The name Solange seemed to soften the edge of Vincent's face without weakening it. She spoke Creole when the house felt too quiet, he continued. People laughed at her English in grocery stores, in offices, in waiting rooms. I was young enough to be afraid of answering them, and old enough to remember every time I failed to. The table stayed frozen. Malcolm's expensive confidence had nowhere to stand now. Vincent looked at Eleanor again. So when you laughed at Miss Baptiste, you did not laugh at a mistake. You laughed at survival. Eleanor's lips parted, but no excuse came out clean enough to use. Naomi felt the words move through her like warm light under a closed door. Survival. That was what her accent had always been. Her mother learning enough English to speak to landlords, doctors, school secretaries, and bus drivers. Naomi learning enough anatomy to pass exams after midnight shifts. A whole family crossing from one life into another without losing the sound of home. Vincent turned toward Malcolm. You came here tonight asking me to trust you with my money. Malcolm straightened, grateful for business language, but Vincent did not give him safety inside it. You sat beside disrespect and called it peace. That tells me everything your proposal could not. Malcolm's face paled. Vincent, let us not make a permanent decision over one uncomfortable exchange. Vincent's eyes remained steady. Character is built from uncomfortable exchanges. Then he looked back at Naomi. Miss Baptiste, you have been more professional than this table deserved. The manager near the host stand finally stepped forward, nervous and late. Mr. Callahan, perhaps I can assign another server. Vincent did not look at him. No, perhaps you can learn why she should not have needed one. The room went silent again, deeper this time. Naomi stood taller without deciding to. The language they had mocked had not been defended as a novelty, but honored as a history. And in that moment, every polished plate at the table reflected the same truth back at them. The woman they tried to reduce had carried more worlds inside her voice than any of them had bothered to hear. Vincent's words left the table with nowhere to hide. The manager stood frozen near the host's stand, one hand still holding the tablet he had brought too late, as if customer service could be summoned after dignity had already been bruised. Naomi remained beside the table, quiet and upright, feeling the strange weight of being protected without being pitted. That mattered. Pity looked down. Recognition looked directly at her. Vincent turned his attention to Eleanor Pierce. You will apologize to Miss Baptiste, he said. Not to the restaurant. Not to me. To her. Eleanor's face tightened. She glanced at Malcolm, expecting rescue. But Malcolm was staring at the untouched contract folder beside Vincent's place, setting as if the leather itself had begun to close. I am sorry if you felt offended, Eleanor said, her voice thin and polished. Vincent did not move. That is not an apology. That is a complaint wearing perfume. A quiet breath passed through the nearby staff. Caleb looked down quickly, hiding the smallest flash of satisfaction. Naomi did not smile. She only waited, her hands folded before her apron, her name tag catching the candlelight. Eleanor swallowed. The room had given her every luxury except escape. Miss Baptiste, she said finally, the name awkward in her mouth because she had avoided using it all night. I am sorry I mocked the way you speak. It was unkind. The words landed imperfectly, but they landed. Naomi held her gaze. Thank you, she said. She did not soften it with forgiveness she was not ready to give. She did not rescue Eleanor from the discomfort she had earned. Vincent looked to Malcolm. As for the proposal, there will be no partnership. Malcolm sat forward at once. Vincent, this is unnecessary. Eleanor apologized. She apologized because money was listening, Vincent replied. Not because conscience arrived. Malcolm's face went pale under the warm light. You are willing to walk away from a multi-million-dollar agreement over a waitress. Vincent's eyes cooled. No. I am walking away because you still call her that when her name has been spoken in front of you. The silence that followed was complete. Even the silverware seemed to stop shining. Vincent closed the contract folder with one hand and placed it beside his untouched glass. A man who stays silent when dignity is cheap will sell it faster when the price is high. Malcolm had no answer. Eleanor looked down at her plate. The other guests became suddenly fascinated by their hands, their water, the dark rain moving over the windows. The manager stepped closer, voice careful. "Miss Baptiste, you may take a break for the rest of the table." Vincent finally looked at him. With full pay for the evening, and without a mark against her shift record. The manager nodded quickly. Naomi felt the night shift around her, not into shame this time, but into air. She placed the bread plate gently on the table, straightened one knife by habit, and then stopped herself. She did not need to make their table perfect after they had tried to make her small. Vincent spoke once more, this time in Creole, low enough that it felt meant only for her. "Kimbi tet o yuwa." Hold your head high. Naomi's eyes warmed, but she did not cry. She had already given enough of herself to that room. She turned toward the service station, where Caleb stood waiting with quiet pride in his face. As she walked away, every step sounded clear against the marble floor. No one laughed. No one corrected her. No one asked where she was really from. For the first time all evening, Bellagio House watched Naomi Baptiste leave a table not as someone dismissed, but as someone whose dignity had changed the terms of the room. Naomi did not return to the VIP table that night, but the room carried her name long after she stepped away from it. In the back hallway, where the air smelled of garlic, lemon, and warm bread, Caleb handed her a glass of water without speaking. She took it with both hands, feeling the coolness steady her palms. Her shift was not over in the old way, but something inside it had ended. The small, familiar shame that used to follow her after moments like this had nowhere to attach itself. Vincent's Creole still echoed in her mind, not as rescue, but as remembrance. Hold your head high. Near midnight, after the last guests had left and Bellagio House softened into candle smoke and polished silence, the manager brought Naomi a sealed pay envelope and an apology that sounded frightened but real enough to begin with. She accepted the envelope. She did not accept responsibility for making him feel better. At the host's stand, Vincent waited with the check folder in front of him. Malcolm and Eleanor Pierce were gone by then, leaving behind half-finished wine, untouched dessert, and a contract that would never become a partnership. Vincent had written one line across the receipt in careful Creole, Lang Ouc Kou. Beneath it, in English, he had added, "Your language is your home." Naomi read the words once, then again, and the dining room blurred at the edges. "My mother used to say something close to that," she said softly. Vincent nodded. "Then she was right before I was." He slid the receipt toward her, not like a tip, not like charity, but like something being returned to its owner. Naomi folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. That night, on the subway back to Brooklyn, she did not practice smoothing her vowels in the dark reflection of the window. She watched the city pass in silver and black, her tired shoes tucked beneath the seat, her nursing textbook against her knees, and for the first time in months, she let her thoughts move in Creole without translating them into apology. When she reached the fourth-floor apartment above the laundromat, Marie Baptiste was still awake, wrapped in a faded blue robe, a mug of tea cooling beside her. Naomi placed the receipt on the kitchen table. Her mother read it under the yellow light, her fingers stopping over the Creole words as if touching a family photograph. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of defeat. "You see," Marie whispered. "Home followed you there." The next morning, Naomi arrived at nursing class with rain still shining on the sidewalk and the receipt tucked inside her notebook. When the instructor called roll, she did not soften her name. She did not rush past it. She lifted her chin and said, "Naomi Baptiste," letting every syllable carry its full weight. A classmate smiled. The instructor repeated it correctly. Nothing dramatic happened. No music swelled. No room bowed. Yet something enormous shifted quietly inside her. Back at Bellagio House, the staff spoke her name with new care, and the manager learned that expensive service meant nothing without human respect. Vincent Callahan never explained the lost deal to anyone who would not understand it. He only returned weeks later, sat at the same table, and ordered the short rib exactly as Naomi had described it. This time, when she spoke, her English carried Brooklyn, Haiti, nursing school, her mother's kitchen, and every world she had survived to stand inside. And that night, Bellagio House learned that broken English is often just courage speaking through more than one world.